Okay, we're continuing with the book Prevent and Reverse Heart Disease. Today we're going to talk about plasma membrane ion pumps, and this is a really useful subject. As a matter of fact, this subject is fundamental to understanding hypertension, which means it's fundamental to understanding atherosclerosis, cerebrovascular disease, and a whole bunch of other things, how these membrane ion pumps work. I've given a previous lecture on this subject, the one called Membrane Ion Pumps, where I go into all these elaborate metaphors and stuff, which, unless you already know it, I think that would be real helpful to you. I'll mention them in this lecture, but in this book I didn't put all the illustrations for it in there. So either way, though, I think that could really help you. But I'll make sense of it in this lecture here. So the baseline resting membrane potential of a cell is negative 65 millivolts, okay? Let's just use that as our baseline resting membrane potential. It varies a little bit from cell to cell, but in general it's about that. Okay, you have these plasma membrane sodium, potassium, ATP pumps, and the key point about them is that they pump 3 positive charges outward, 3 sodiums, and they bring 2 potassiums inward. So you have a net positive charge going out. So that's a current, because there's a net direction of current flow. Positive charge flowing out of the cell. The charges are separated across the plasma membrane. So you've got charge separation and a pump, current flow. This is a battery, okay? You build up a gradient whereby sodium is higher on the outside. It is at a baseline. The extracellular matrix is like seawater. And because sodium wants to come into the cell to equalize its electrochemical gradient, both from an electrical point of view, there's a negative charge inside the cell, and from a concentration point of view, the concentration of sodium is 10 times higher outside the cell than inside the cell. That means it's very energetically favorable to allow sodium to come into the cell. And allowing sodium to come into the cell can be coupled to pumping calcium outside the cell. Just to understand extracellular space versus intracellular space, extracellular space is like the ocean. So when God created life on Earth, He created it in the ocean. And we all know that seawater is salt water. So it's very high in sodium chloride. You have to know that. Always remember that. Seawater is the same thing as salt water, sodium chloride, and it's the same thing as extracellular space. So the extracellular space is always high in sodium. That's what you need to know. The next thing is the water in the sea, it rinses against the rocks, which are made out of calcium carbonate, limestone, and then it rinses calcium into the seawater. So seawater is also, besides being high in sodium, it's always high in calcium, and seawater is the same thing as extracellular space. You have to know that. Trust me, that is buku, super important. If you get that, everything else I tell you will be simple to understand. So the extracellular space is like seawater, meaning high in sodium. The sodium rinsing over the rocks, making it high in calcium. Extracellular space is very, very high in sodium and calcium. All right, so ions want to equalize their gradient across the plasma membrane. Given the opportunity to do so, they will. All right, so what this means is that sodium wants to get into the cell. Calcium also wants to get into the cell. As a matter of fact, the concentration of calcium outside the cell is about 10,000 times what it is inside the cell. So what happens now is, again, I'm going to give these ions personalities, because if you think of them as having a personality, it'll be a lot easier to remember what they do. You can think of potassium as like dear old dad, working his butt off all day long to try to provide for the family. Okay? You can think of magnesium as Uncle Magnesium, the hero. Uncle Magnesium is a brave hero, and he hangs on to the 2nd and 3rd phosphate of ATP so they don't break apart until they're supposed to. So think of magnesium as the hero. You have to have magnesium in order to run your ATP-related reactions, and there's a lot of them. Magnesium comes from the center of a plant cell. It's in the center of chlorophyll. All right. Now, you can think of calcium as being the matriarch, the wife, and she's like a bitch and a half. She comes in like an aristocrat and just bosses everybody around. So let's say she gets home from work, she walks in the house, as usual, it's a big mess, and she just starts yelling at everybody. You, how come you didn't put the dishes in the dishwasher? You, how come you didn't clean up the dog crap? You, how come you didn't clean up the garage? You said you were going to do it. You're such a lazy ass. Okay, so when she comes home, calcium bursts into the cell and just starts yelling at everybody and grouching out, and everybody runs in the room and hides. Okay, but what I'm basically trying to say is calcium is the matriarch aristocratic boss, the boss, not completely unreasonable, uncontested, demands that things be done. So Whenever a cell is going to be activated, that means calcium is coming to the cytoplasm, and then boom, the cell does whatever it's supposed to do. So if it's a vascular smooth muscle, when calcium in the cytoplasm gets high, it will contract and it'll narrow the diameter of the artery. Okay, whatever that cell does, it will do it when calcium comes in. If it's a neuron, it'll release its neurotransmitter. If it's a skeletal muscle, it'll contract. A heart muscle, it'll contract. Okay, if it's a beta cell in the pancreatic islets, it'll release insulin. It'll do whatever it's made to do. And we care most, because we're talking about hypertension, about vascular smooth muscle, so it will contract, narrow the diameter of the artery, and raise the blood pressure. Okay, and now you need to eat a high potassium diet and a low sodium diet to have the proper distribution of these ions around the cell. Otherwise, you'll start messing up these gradients. And the typical American is eating way too much sodium, not enough potassium, and they start dissipating these gradients where sodium just keeps accumulating inside the cell, and it weakens the electrochemical gradient. I'll explain what that means in a moment. By the way, sodium is the angry poor. I'll explain what that means in a moment too. It'll make more sense. K stands for kalium, the Latin word for potassium. N stands for natrium, the Latin word for sodium. Okay, let's see here. A lot of cells, they use, an average cell uses about 1/3 of its energy for the ATP, for the sodium-potassium pump. Neurons will use 1/2 to 2/3 of their cells. So it's super important if a cell is going to use most of its energy for that purpose. And it does so because it's the electrical battery with which it uses to run everything else along the plasma membrane, which is where the cell takes stuff in and throws stuff out. The best book that summarizes all this pathophysiology is Richard Moore's book, The High Blood Pressure Solution. Richard Moore's a real smart guy, he's an MD, PhD. He devoted his whole career to studying ion pumps in plasma membranes, okay? And it's a magnificent book. It's in my top 50 greatest health and nutrition books ever written. I wrote an entire book called that, The Top 50 Books in Health and Nutrition. I gave a lecture about that, a good lecture on that over at VegSource. So if you want to see it, that's a good one. It's basically a way to find your path through the nutrition and health literature. And I just put all the best stuff I read. Because I read, for every book I put in there, I've read at least 20 others, but more than that. But these are the best ones. These are the ones that are groundbreaking academic orgasms, okay? So like I was saying, our ancestors probably ate 15 or 20 times more potassium than sodium, whereas a modern person does the opposite. They eat way more sodium than potassium, okay? Remember that P for potassium and P for plants. It comes from plants. That's where sodium comes from. Magnesium is in the center of chlorophyll, so it also comes from plants. That's the good stuff. And they come from inside the cell. And that's highly relevant because when you eat a whole food, you're getting the potassium and the magnesium. But if you process the food, to process the food means that you grind it up and then you push the potassium and the magnesium out of the cell. You rinse it with water, you rinse it with solvents, and you rinse away the potassium and the magnesium. So processed food is very low in potassium and magnesium. It's the way you can tell if a food is real or not. Just look at the ratio of potassium to sodium. If the potassium's high, sodium's low, it's probably pretty real, relatively unprocessed food. If it's the opposite, it's a processed food. And the more high that gradient is, the worse the food. Okay. Some really, really severe kidney failure patients can't handle potassium and they have to be extra careful about their diet. For example, they might want to eat more starches, which are lower in potassium compared with fruits, which are very high in potassium. I'll show you a chart of K factors, ratios of potassium to sodium, coming up in a little bit. Okay, here's what I meant by magnesium is the hero, Uncle Magnesium. He hangs on to the second and third phosphate of ATP. ATP means adenosine triphosphate. Okay, so that this extra phosphate is only released at the key moment in a chemical reaction. These phosphates, they really want to bust apart. That's why they call it a high energy bond, because these negative charges are repelling each other. So you need the positive charge of magnesium and the bravery of magnesium to hold them into place so they don't burst apart prematurely. So magnesium's got that 2+ positive charge to stabilize them. So here's a picture of magnesium in the center of chlorophyll. And that's why you get it from eating plants. Okay, and that's also why I say you can't get around eating a plant-based diet. All this stuff like eat for your type, that's a bunch of nonsense. You have to get your potassium and your magnesium to run these ion pumps. And so here's a quote from the Bible, 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 8. Above all, love each other deeply, for love covers a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to each other. Use whatever gifts you have received to help others. Yeah, there's the message of Christianity for you. So anyways, here it is for health. Above all, eat the low-fat vegan diet because it covers over a multitude of diet and lifestyle sins. It's the truth. You need the plant food because you need the fibers to maintain your gut so you don't have leaky gut and you don't get leaky blood-brain barrier. You have to have it, okay? You need potassium because it's a vasodilator, and magnesium because this is what you need to relax your vascular smooth muscle. You also want your nitrate, plant nitrates. Those are your precursors for nitric oxide. You want your antioxidants, which come from plants because they have to deal with being out in the sun all day. And you want the alkalinity that comes with plants. All the good stuff's in plants other than B12. And that comes from bacteria. Okay, here's K-factor concept. And basically K-factor is the ratio of potassium to sodium. You want yours to be a minimum of 5 to 1. I would say you really want it 10 to 1 or better. That means you want to eat 10 times more potassium than sodium, or even higher a ratio of sodium to potassium. Okay. For a person who's in severe kidney failure and they're worried about their ability to excrete potassium, they can just check their blood levels, and have a dietitian or a physician working with them to help them do that. Okay. I know my own diet, I probably eat 20 to 25 to 1 like our ancestors did because I'm 100% whole food vegan. Okay, here's another important point. To maintain cell osmolality and membrane voltage, the amount of potassium and sodium inside a cell, it has to be constant. You can't have a fluctuating ionic concentrations that big of a flux because otherwise water, let's say you got hyperosmolar inside the cell, the water would just flow in and it would burst the cell. So these ionic gradients, even though an individual gradient can be changed, the overall gradients, they have to be kept about the same. So what that means is when you eat tons and tons of sodium, the body can't excrete it fast enough. It's going to accumulate inside your cells and dissipate the sodium electrochemical gradient, okay? Because the Kn is a constant. Sodium plus potassium is a constant. You can't get around that. There is no way to get around that. You can't change that with a pill. You can't, diet around it. You have to deal with that. So that's why you want to eat the plant-based diet or you're going to have a hard time maintaining your ion pumps. And if you can't maintain your plasma membrane ion pumps, you ain't going to be too healthy. Okay, when a person eats too much sodium, they end up voiding, urinating out their potassium, and this will mess up their plasma membrane ion gradients. Okay, that's the whole cell's whole electrical system. Just think about anything in the modern world. If it doesn't have an electrical system, it don't work so well. Okay, here's a little bit more detailed picture of cell physiology. So again, dear old dad, potassium, working and working and working to try to make the cell function, to help the family. Magnesium, Uncle Magnesium, the heroic one, holding ATP into place until it's ready to react. Then there's the angry pour, the sodium saying, let me in, let me in. And you say, no, you don't come in until we say so. Okay, but when you're ready to let sodium come in, you couple that to pumping calcium out. Because when calcium's inside the cell, it's not going to stop bossing everybody around, making the cell do something. Okay, so it is the aristocratic matriarch boss. Okay. The reason why this all works is because you've got far more numerous sodium, potassium, ATP pumps than you do these other things. Okay. Usually the sodium-calcium exchange is abbreviated NCX. Na is for natrium, Ca is for calcium. And again, it's abbreviated NaX. Okay. So here's the gradients. Typically, the gradient for sodium is about 10 to 1, 10 times more sodium inside the cell. 10 times more sodium, outside the cell. So 140 to 14, okay? Potassium is really just the opposite. It's about 10 to 1 in the other direction. Calcium, like I said, is about 10,000 to 1 because these are nanomolar. That's millimolar, okay? So that's why I call sodium the angry pour, wanting to get into the cell. It's primary active transport to pump the sodium out with an ATP. So that's primary active transport. And then coupling the sodium gradient to something else is secondary active transport for like the NACA exchanger. Okay, now here's what you've been waiting for. This is the big K-factor table. And there's a fundamental principle I'm going to give you that's going to explain the whole thing to you. You remember this pretty easily the rest of your life. Fruits are about 100 to 500 to 1. That means fruits tend to have 100 to 500 times more potassium than sodium. So fruits give you tons of potassium. We are made for that. Okay, look at a banana, 450 milligrams of sodium for each one of potassium. Okay. Now let's look at starches. Starches are more in the ballpark of about 20 to 100. So here's white rice, K-factor of 60. Green beans, K-factor of 40. Peas, K-factor of 50. Lentils, K-factor of 50. Black beans, K-factor of 19. Potato, K-factor 40. Sweet potatoes got a K-factor as low as 14. Okay. Then you look at salads. Salads don't really have much of a K-factor. Theirs is about 5 to 20. Okay, now take a look at meat. Meat, ground beef's about 4, so it's not that bad. It's bad, but not that bad. But then look at these processed foods. They stink. Potato chips, K-factor of 0.9. And a lot of these cereals, they put so much salt in them, so much sodium in them, they have K-factors of 0.06, less than 0.1. So you can see the pattern. The best K-factor ratios come from fruits. They'll prevent hypertension. Then starches, then veggies. Okay. Processed foods are a disaster. They're in the wrong direction. So there it is. You know, if you want to, you can think of eating fruits and starches as like antihypertensive medications. Okay, that's what your body wants and needs. Okay, and that'll lower your risk of stroke and heart attack and everything else. So we'll call it at this point. If you want more information on those plasma membrane ion pumps, I would recommend my lecture called Membrane Ion Pumps with metaphors. It's a masterpiece of a lecture. I'm proud of that one. It's one of my best lectures. So anyways, hope you found this helpful.